Welcome to the Nourished Child Podcast, a show about childhood nutrition, feeding kids, and dealing with the ups and downs of growing a healthy child. Here's your host, registered dietitian and childhood nutrition expert, Jill Castle.
Hey friends, welcome back to the Nourished Child Podcast. I have a great episode lined up for you today. We are talking about social media, food perfectionism, and how this causes parents like you perpetual guilt and shame. And I have the perfect guest to talk about this. Her name is Sarah Ladden, and she's a registered dietitian, nutritionist, and family feeding expert. She's the founder of Better Family Meals. So if you've been on Instagram, you can find her over at Better Family Meals. But she also runs a pediatric nutrition private practice in Glastonbury, Connecticut, and helps families basically feed their children better. She works with parents to address common feeding challenges, eliminate food-related stress and anxiety, and to help families establish positive eating habits and behaviors. And that's exactly what we're talking about today, how social media can be the perpetuating stress inducer for all of us. If you've ever gone on social media and felt like you aren't doing things right or you're not enough, that's exactly what we're talking about today. So without further delay, here's my guest, Sarah Ladden. Hey, Sarah. Welcome to the Nourished Podcast.
Thank you so much. I'm so thrilled to be here. Thanks for asking me.
You are so welcome. I'm excited to share you with my audience. And before we begin, though, let's have you tell us about yourself and the work that you do in your own words.
Yeah, absolutely. So I, like you, am a registered dietitian nutritionist and sort of do my work in the pediatric feeding space. I have a private practice in Glastonbury, Connecticut, called Better Family Meals. And, I really work with families one-on-one to help them address some of the anxiety and stress that comes kind of with the everyday challenges of feeding a family.
Awesome. And we know each other. I've known you for a few years. I've watched you start your business, watched you build your social media platform. And I know today we're going to talk a little bit about how social media can kind of make those anxieties a little bit worse.
Yeah.
And I'm just curious because you've been building your platform and I'm sure you've been noticing things along the way. And I'm curious as to what have you noticed in terms of, social media and the world of pediatric nutrition?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it's interesting because I think it, really started when I became a mom. And that was sort of when, I was kind of thrust headfirst into the world of, parenting online and kind of going online for answers and for commiseration. And it was really eye-opening because I think when I went there looking for, really solid advice, I found myself getting more and more confused. And I'm saying this as as somebody who does this professionally. And so what I really found was, when you're a new parent, you're sort of inundated with lots of information, whether you're looking for information on breastfeeding or bottle feeding or baby-led weaning or just introducing solids. And then when your child is old enough and can join you at the table, the information absolutely dries up. It's sort of like, wash your hands and, you got them to eat solids and now they know how to eat. And, in my experience, that's when all of the questions come. And so, when I was looking online for information for myself, I really said, there's not a lot here. So that was sort of when, I decided to take my career into another direction and really focus on, helping to clear up some of that information and some of the, confusion and anxiety that I was experiencing myself, my friends and family were experiencing.
Yeah, I think it's so interesting that you mentioned, when kids become school age, the information dries up. And it does. Yeah. And it's not only on social media, it dries up at the pediatrician's office. Yeah. It dries up in schools. I mean, it's just the older kids get, and boy, when you get to the teen years, it's like nobody wants to touch that. Yep. That's a really complicated beast. But, what is curious to me, and I would love your thoughts on this. What is curious to me is the drive to go to social media in the first place for nutrition information. What do you make of that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a double-edged sword, right? Social media. I think certainly there are times when it provides a wonderful resource in terms of a community, right? Particularly, I think, during transition periods in your life, like motherhood. So it provides this source of community, like I said, this source of kind of camaraderie where you feel like, oh, I'm not the only one who has questions about this. And so for me, I know that was just sort of a natural place, kind of as a millennial mom, that I, gravitated towards. Whereas, when I would go to my pediatrician's office, like, as we all know, pediatricians are not trained in nutrition. And so I think I was getting sort of a lot of, blanket information. But I really wanted to take a deeper dive. And also, as my kids got older, I was less focused on kind of what they were eating and decided to kind of delve deeper into more of the how of feeding. And that is really, where you go online and you find lots of information, whether it's about, the division of responsibility in feeding or responsive feeding. And so I was really kind of immersing myself in this world and, again, looking for information, but finding lots of conflicting information and finding lots of people who, are selling themselves as mom experts, because they have children, but not necessarily, experts in the field of nutrition.
Yeah. And that's true. There are a lot of influencers out there. Yeah. And it's, maybe let's break that down a little bit because we have health influencers, we have mom influencers, we have brand influencers. You've got registered dietitians who are trying to be influencers. I guess anybody who's on social media is sort of an influencer on some level. But it's quite a mosh pit when you look at like everyone out there who's trying to tell you how to feed your kid and what to feed your kid and what's the latest and greatest, eating pattern.
Yep.
What does that do for the parent who is trying to suss through what is real and what is promotional and what is, partnered with brands versus, I mean, there's just a lot of confusion out there.
Yeah. And I think it becomes even more of an issue because what parents are looking for is for somebody to tell them what to do. When I work with families, they want a formula. They want to know what to feed, when to feed, how to feed, and they want you to write it down and they want to follow it by the letter. And unfortunately, like all parts of parenting, there's not a formula for feeding your kids. There's so much nuance to feeding. Yeah. And I think what a lot of these influencer accounts offer is, some sort of magic bullet. Just do what I do and, your kids will eat like my kids, and, it's a false bill of goods because as you and I know, kids are so different and we all have kids with, very different personalities, even within the same family. And a feeding personality is no different. So what's going to work for one child in terms of feeding advice, will most certainly not work for the child that's sitting right next to them at the same table. So I think sometimes that's why you see these, maybe non-credentialed influencers who don't necessarily have to follow, the same code that you and I do, really kind of getting a lot of followers, getting a lot of attention because again, they're selling a quick fix, which doesn't really exist in the world of kid feeding.
Yeah, I have a little anecdotal story to tell about this, and I think you'll appreciate it. I had a client once who, I love to talk about the psychology of eating. I love to present the science, and I like to talk about the nuances. Like that excites me. It's like you said, you might have a child who's an avid eater. Why is that child an avid eater? Well, they might have appetitive traits that make them that way. They might have been restricted at some point. They might, there's a long list. And this client at one point was like, I just want to know what to feed my child. And I said, oh, okay. You're looking for something prescriptive.
Yeah.
And she was like, that's it. I want you to tell me exactly. Like, I don't necessarily want to know. Don't tell me that, there are children who are living in poverty and in food insecure, because I'm not that person.
Mm-hmm.
That's what she said to me. I'm not that person. I have all the means I need to get what I want. So tell me exactly what I should be getting. And that really, I was like, wow, we have to know all this stuff, and we have to be able to read our clients and match them. Match their brains, match their resources, match their attitudes first, before we can sort of get super nuanced all the time.
Yeah. And sort of along those lines, I have a lot of people who come to me, for a kid that they perceive as a picky eater, with a list of, foods that they want to get their child to eat.
Yeah.
Things like, all the nutrient dense superfoods that you sort of see online, like, and thinking there's something really wrong with my child, that they're not, eating the avocado or eating, the dates that all the kids that they're seeing on these accounts are eating. And, what we really do is sit back and kind of break it down and understand, why is this important to you? And sort of where are you getting this messaging that these specific foods are necessary in your kid's diet? I always laugh. I did not try an avocado until I was well into my 20s.
Same.
It's just like
guacamole.
Right. And I'm fine, and your kid's going to be fine too. And you know what? They may be a kid that never grows up to eat an avocado, and that's okay.
Yeah.
So I think, a lot of times the messaging that I want to share with parents is, it's okay if, your child is not a quote unquote perfect eater. That is never the goal. And what my personal goal for my kids is to have them be relaxed eaters, more than kind of perfect eaters, because what I ideally want for my kids, and, really for all kids, is that when they're around food, they have a more relaxed attitude. If it's a favorite food, that they're cool, calm, and collected around it. Yeah. If it's a not favorite food, again, they're cool, calm, and collected around it. And they're sort of able to navigate the world of food without this really high level of stress and anxiety. And I think that should be the ultimate goal as a parent, versus necessarily this, this idea of, a perfect nutrient dense diet.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think that I love that, because I think from put the professional hat on, I do want kids to have that nutrient rich diet, but I know there's a lot of different ways to get there. Right. But I see a lot of anxious eaters these days, a lot of anxious feeders. So parents. And I do believe that when a parent is anxious about feeding their kid, they're passing on some of that anxiety to their child.
Yeah.
And so I really love the comment around a relaxed eater, regardless of the food that they're around. That really resonates.
And one of the things that I do with families I work with is, because I work mainly with the parents, and a lot of the work I do is either remote or we're in my office, and I'm not at the dinner table with them.
Right.
So oftentimes I will have them film a couple eating occasions for me, and then we watch it back together. And it's always such an eye-opening moment for the parents to sort of step back and objectively look at the eating environment. And we often like parse it out and say, look at the language you're using, look at the body language, look at, how many times are you, directing the child to their plate? How much micromanagement is going on? And would that to you be a comfortable environment for you to eat in? And so that's often, the first place that we start with before we ever get to talking about the food is just looking at what is the eating environment that you are setting up in your home? And, how do you address that in a way that, focuses more on allowing a child to feel, safe and comfortable at the family dinner table? And that is often, I think, the hardest first step for parents to take is, because that requires a lot of self-reflection. Sure. And I think we're all really hesitant to, look in the mirror and say, oh, okay, so I have some issues, with control, and I need to, step back and really take a look at myself.
Yeah. And oftentimes I find parents are not coming into those appointments expecting that you're going to look at their feeding dynamics, right? So that sort of sidesteps what the expectation a lot of parents come into counseling or consultation with. They're coming in like, let's talk about food. Let's improve the food I'm feeding. Let's get my kid to eat healthier. And, so when you kind of don't start there, it can be a risk for some families when you don't start there, but oftentimes it is so eye-opening. It blows parents' minds sometimes to be like, wow, this is really having such an impact that I had no idea.
Yeah. And they're often the easiest things to kind of influence something immediately. When you say to a parent, like, let's try for the week, stop plating your child's food, let them plate it for themselves. And, and we'll connect next week and we can talk about, what happened. I often have parents sort of journal what's going on throughout the week. Yeah. And it's amazing when they come back and they say, wait a minute, the entire dynamic of our family dinner changed when I told the kids, like, pick what you want to put on your plate. And so to me, sort of starting off from that place when they have that big aha moment, because they do see it in practice, it's really, like I said, really eye-opening for parents.
And a win. I think it's also a win for sure. Yep. When kids you immediately calm down that family meal table when kids have a little bit more agency there.
Yep.
So let's talk a little bit about perfectionism, food perfectionism. As we look at the social media lens, how it's affecting parents today, they're getting maybe a warped perception of what food is supposed to look like, what eaters are supposed to look like on social media, and what is that causing harm? Is it benign? I mean, what are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think food and feeding kids online has become aspirational versus practical. And I think that's doing a big disservice to parents. I think one of the things that parents forget is when they see influencers online filming this content and showing these beautiful, rainbow bento boxes going out the door for lunch, this is their job. Their job is as, content makers, and they're doing this to make money. And for us then to try to, take all of that aspirational content and bring it back into our own homes. And then we wonder kind of like the amount of time, the amount of resources, the amount of money that it's taking us to try to recreate something where it's like, well, I just saw it on a reel. It couldn't be that hard. So I think sometimes it's expectation setting to understand, like, this is what you're seeing online, like, as everybody says, is not real life. So that's the first point. The second point is, I do think there's a lot of specific, like, nutrition perfectionism that we're seeing online. And, it's really, unfortunately, just another form of like diet culture that's being disguised as, quote unquote, healthy parenting. And, I think that in itself can be really dangerous, because when you see I see a lot of accounts talking about clean eating for kids. And there's a lot of guilt and shame around, well, if you're not feeding this way for your kids, then, you don't love them enough. Or, if you are serving your kids processed foods, well, then you're setting them up for a lifetime of, disease and unwellness. So I think there's that aspect to it. I also see a lot of nutrification of food. So for example, I can't tell you the number of recipes that I see in my social media feed each day that are just adding protein powder to everything under the sun. Or, where, you can't ever serve your kids brownies that don't have black beans in them. And this sort of idea that every single feeding occasion has to be, amplified to the X degree in terms of nutrients and nutrition. I think it's an unrealistic expectation, and it's just not the way, we should eat or our kids should be eating.
Where do you think that comes from, though? What? I mean, some of it I'm sure is coming from social media, but I think on the greater scale, where is this coming from?
Well, I think a lot of people have disordered eating tendencies to begin with. You know what I mean? And if you are a parent and you come into parenting with that, I don't think it disappears overnight. And I think some of it, like I said, is influenced by diet culture. Some of it's influenced by, fat phobia. I mean, I always ask families I work with, to step back again and think of the rationale for why they're doing something. And what is the underlying fear that you have if your child doesn't eat this way or continues to eat this other way? And oftentimes it is, related to, fear of weight gain or, fear of, not having a kid who's like all the other kids. So I think that's where a lot of it comes from. I mean, I'd be interested to know from your perspective, because, I've only had a private practice in the age of social media. And I'm just curious for you, what have you noticed in terms of exactly what we're talking about, what parents are bringing into sessions now compared to, let's say in the early 2000s when we didn't have all of this outside pressure and everybody trying to live up to these expectations? Was it still there? Was it there in a different form?
I think it was still there. I think when I look back on sort of that first iteration of my private practice back in 2008, I was seeing kids who were carrying extra body fat. That's when they would sort of cross my threshold. And the attitude was, we need to improve diet and nutrition, and we need to help this child lose weight. That was the pediatrician attitude. That was the family attitude. And I was the one who was like, well, we're not going on a diet. We can be moving more. We can, upgrade or change some of our eating patterns and food decisions, but never in the context of we're going to, calorie restrict and create weight loss. I always have believed in, kids are always dynamically growing. And when you get the habits in place, things sort of sort themselves out. What I would say today is kids, if they are coming in with a little bit of extra body fat, it's subtle amounts. It's parents are getting concerned earlier and wanting to, reverse things. And the underlying fear is not so much, I'm showing up, my child's carrying extra body fat, and we have high cholesterol, we have hypertension, and we have significant mobility issues. Now it's, my child is getting pudgy, and I'm concerned that it's going to continue and get out of control. And I'm concerned because other kids are commenting, and I'm worried about their self-esteem.
Yeah.
And so the conversation is a little bit different, but I think the underlying, fear of what this says about the child, what this says about the parent is all very, very similar still.
Yeah.
But it has evolved. I mean, it has evolved. And I think I just personally feel there's just much more of a social attitude about bodies and size that is more aggressive and damaging today than it was 10 years ago. That's not to downplay that it wasn't damaging back then, 10 years ago. I just think it's a little more aggressive now.
Yeah. And I was also just thinking, as you were saying that another thing that's changed is the parents' access to information, right?
Yes.
So parents are coming in now armed with all of this nutrition information.
Yes.
And like we said before, I mean, it's not necessarily nutrition information that's coming from, verified sources. So I think that can also be a big challenge, is that when you're sitting down, I think there's a lot more myth busting now that we need to do with parents and sort of expectation setting, where, maybe in years past, it was just, I'm going to see the expert, they know. And now everybody is an expert.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, that's for sure. I think too, one of the things that strikes me is that, and this is, I think, is human nature, be it a parent who wants to do better, wants to change, wants to, help their child have a better relationship with food. And they recognize that their relationship with food isn't so great, and they want to work on that too. And that's a very beautiful thing when the child and the adult are experiencing growth in those areas at the same time.
Yeah.
But what is interesting as sort of the dietitian in the room is watching, like, sometimes the real stuff comes out in stress and frustration. And those deeply ingrained food attitudes and beliefs and body attitudes that come from childhood, those really can rear their head. And it's clear to me, it's become clear to me that, like, this is not a quick fix. I mean, the attitudes about food, they don't change just by hearing that, all foods can fit. And when we're shaming half of the foods on the planet, it just doesn't work for your kid, and it probably hasn't worked for you either. So that's been an interesting observation, is to see how quickly those old, ingrained, entrenched beliefs, they stick around for a long time.
Well, yeah. And you also think about a lot of the people who are parenting now were raised, in the 80s and in the 90s and, even the early 2000s. And the 90s and the early 2000s was a really, hard time for eating, where diet culture really, really came into play. I mean, I can remember growing up with, a fridge full of lean cuisine. And just like it was, and SnackWells and all of that. And I think we were so inundated with messages about calorie control at an early age. And I see that popping up over and over and over again. And one of the places I see that happening is, when parents are serving snacks. I think there's this ingrained belief that a snack should just be like a low calorie, like, fix. Like, it's not necessarily needed. It's almost like a cheat. And so a lot of the work I do with parents is kind of deconstructing that and saying, no. You have a growing child, and eating every, 2 to 3 hours and, refueling those energies, is really necessary. And so stepping back and kind of, again, looking at those ingrained beliefs, like about snack foods, and they should be really low calorie. I can't tell you the number of parents who come in whose kids are only eating, either pretzels or, carrot sticks or a low calorie, mozzarella cheese stick for, in a 3-hour increment before the next meal. And I'm thinking like, there is not enough fuel here. And particularly, during a school day when we're seeing that and kids are coming home and they are absolutely famished. And then, it starts this cycle of, well, dinner's not for another 3 hours. And, parents kind of trying to
hold them off.
And to patch up the day in terms of like, well, I'm just going to give you a little bit of something here and it's not really going to have a lot of calories or sustenance to it. And then I think that's when you can see things really start to escalate in terms of kids being underfed, and, and really sort of seeking, sustenance in other ways.
Yeah. 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 I've said this for a long time, but feeding kids is one of the hardest jobs of parenthood. It was hard for me 27 years ago. I think it's hard for everybody today, even in the presence of all of this information that we have.
Yeah.
So let's, if you were to think about influencers, health influencers, or just social influencers, how can we collectively do a better job at normalizing, neutralizing food and feeding for children?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are a few people that are doing it really well. A few of the bigger accounts. So Amy Palangian, I think, does an amazing job over at Yummy Toddler Food. And she's one of these influencers who is very transparent when she puts out content to say, listen, this is my job. These beautiful, recipes I develop and the photos that go along with them. That's my job, is to produce that content. And this is not necessarily the food that my own kids are eating, and to say like, this whole beautiful, bento box and all of this stuff, the expectation that your kids are necessarily having all of this it's just false. So she does a great job at that. Virginia Soul Smith, I think, does an excellent job of talking parents through, again, this idea of what reality is and what, feeding kids, like you said, looks like on a daily basis, and how to kind of reduce your stress load by, giving up some of these, shoulds and need to. I think she does a great job. But yeah, I mean, I think in general with social media influencers, I think like what I try to do on my page is, if I'm showing, a beautiful meal that I created for my family, I also kind of step back and say, but you'll see like there's a deconstructed version of this in the corner. And so while I may have, one child who eats the mixed casserole, but two of my other kids would never eat that. And so for them, I want to make sure that we're still having, a meal together and sharing in a meal, but I also want them to feel, safe and comfortable and fed at the table. And so, having those options there is not a failure, and I think that's important to let parents know, is that when you're, this idea, this expectation that's been set up for you, that everything you make, if your kids aren't, necessarily eating a balanced plate at every meal, that you then need to really pressure them to do that, because if not, they're not meeting their nutrient goals for the day. I mean, I think I saw a post that you made recently, talking about, stepping back and looking at, let's take a week-long view. Let's take a couple weeks view in terms of, nutrients that your kids are eating versus every single plate, every single meal. And I think that's where a lot of parents get tripped up. And that's where a lot of this pressure on the kids comes from is, if you see your kid, they didn't eat the chicken at dinner tonight. Well, no one's getting up from the table until that chicken has been eaten. So I think like
really
understanding, it does take the joy out, and understanding though, that when you see, for example, like a My Plate icon, right? And you have half this plate with fruits and veggies and whole grains and, lean proteins. Yes, that is an ideal. And we certainly want to, show our kids, what a meal like that looks like and model for them. But
Right.
in reality, how kids are eating is not necessarily a balanced diet like that at every single meal. I think for adults, when we make our plate, we're making it intellectually because we know what it looks like. But for kids, what I find is kids kind of tend to cluster eat different macronutrients. So they may have, one day where you're like, I can't believe they're eating this many carbs. And then 2 days later, you're like, they haven't eaten a carb all day, but they're devouring every piece of protein in the house, or they go, weeks on end without eating any produce. And then suddenly it's like, you can't stock enough berries in your fridge. So I think, taking, again, like you said, the long view of things is really helpful versus looking, plate to plate.
Yeah, I agree. I also think too that, there's this challenge that I don't know that a lot of parents sort of embrace. And that is, how to go about feeding a family with some sort of structure and boundaries and system, even though you have 3 or 4 or 2 or 1, different eaters at the table. Like, how do you go about creating this system and structure, even though you've got some kids who won't touch some of the things on the table? You've got some kids who will finish their meal in 5 minutes flat, and the other child is taking 25 minutes to finish the meal. I mean, this is what I think gets parents really tripped up. And I've always sort of abided by what worked for me, which is try to hit all the food groups, get them in the center of the table, and let everybody pick and choose and let them be who they're going to be at the table. Like, you can have expectations around behavior, but not around eating. I think when we start to have expectations around what a child's eating, how much they're eating, then things get weird. They get weird for the child. Then the parent's in this position where they're pushing and nagging and trying to, steer the boat in a different direction, if you will. And I feel like that's one of the questions that always keeps coming up. And I'm curious what you say to your families, or how you would respond to your families around that.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that I always talk about is de-emphasizing any particular meal. Yeah. So I think what tends to happen is, like, dinner is the family meal of the day. It's when everybody comes together. But it's also the time of day, particularly when you have young children, that they're done. They are done for the day by, 6:30, 7 o'clock. And so I think a lot of our expectations around family dinner in particular, where everybody's going to sit, we're going to have this 20-minute long dinner, we're going to have a nice conversation, and then, enter these kids who have been sitting all day at school, who, might not have, fueled up for the day. So now you're dealing with a pack of hangry kids. Yeah. And again, they're sitting down, and there's a lot of families where dinner is one instruction after the other for the kids. It's, have more of that, have less of this, sit up, use your fork correctly. And I think, what I try to talk to parents about is, just let's have a time where we're sitting together. You're putting the food on the table. You're always making sure that there are, safe and reliable foods on that table that your kid is going to eat. And then let be done with it. Let's take the emphasis off the food and just focus on, the family. And also the expectation that you're going to get a 20-minute meal out of it. It's fine if your kids sit for 5 minutes. And particularly if you have little kids. I mean, what I often tell parents is this is a moment in time, this is not forever, because you have a child who, eats and then goes and runs around for the rest of the meal. It doesn't mean that when they're 35 years old, they're not going to be able to sit at the dinner table.
Right. Right. It's a season.
Yeah.
I love the word season. It's a season of childhood where.
Yeah.
So I guess my last question for you will be, again, circling back to social media and overt harm.
Yep.
Are there situations that you see that you would want parents to know about in terms of just really watch out for these kind of messages? They may undermine your confidence. They may be flat out wrong. I mean, what is out there that you believe parents should really sort of put on their Scooby sense and deeply investigate?
Anytime you see any sort of really black and white thinking, I think that that's a real red flag where, like we talked about before, where you're getting really, really prescriptive advice.
Mm-hmm.
I think that can be really dangerous because, again, it doesn't take in this nuance of how individual kids eat. I think the idea of, normative eating is also very dangerous.
Mm-hmm.
This idea that, all kids eventually, like the goal is to get them to eat in a certain way as adults because, we know that not all kids are the same. And particularly, I think that can be challenging if you're a parent of, a kid who's neurodivergent, a kid. I see a lot of, parents with kids who have ADHD who are, on medication, and that's really affecting their appetite. And then, when you're dealing with sort of situations like that, and you're trying to fit those kids into this very specific hole of, this is what normal or typical eating looks like, I think you're always going to run into problems. I also think, obviously off the bat, anybody who's talking about, good foods, bad foods, healthy foods, unhealthy foods, anytime we're moralizing food choices, that's like an immediate red flag for me.
Yeah, same. Well, this has been an awesome conversation, Sarah.
Yeah.
Where can people get in contact with you and find you out in the world?
Yeah, absolutely. So obviously my social media is a great place to start. And that's at Better Family Meals.
Mm-hmm.
And my website as well, betterfamilymeals.com. And I'm pretty active on both of those. So
yeah, you do a great job. And it's been delightful to have you on the show and have this conversation. Thanks for coming.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jill. This was fabulous.
Many thanks for listening to this episode of The Nourished Child, and much gratitude to Sarah for joining the show and sharing her time and insight for you. If you enjoyed this episode and want to support this show and my work, please take a minute to follow the podcast, leave a rating and review, and visit thenourishedchild.com to sign up for my weekly newsletter, The Munch. You can also follow me on Instagram at i.am.pdrd, and don't forget to take my Healthy Habits quiz on thenourishedchild.com and get your copy of Kids Thrive at Every Size. That's it for this week, but in the meantime, give that child in your life a loving squeeze today. Bye for now.
Thanks for listening to the Nourished Child podcast, where the #1 goal is to help you grow a nourished child inside and out.